Well, thanks everybody for joining today. You know, the business environment, the business landscape today is very dynamic and clearly a VUCA environment. And that environment has caused the HR function to evolve significantly, and I'd add quickly. The volume and velocity of changes, challenges, and issues, opportunities they face are unprecedented. HR leaders are increasingly tasked to optimize structures, evolve cultures, and set curriculums for leadership excellence and talent development. Our work and discussions with CHROs and their teams brings us even closer to the complexity and breadth of their role today, which is far greater than any other time in the past. On today's podcast, we have a roundtable with a few of our most experienced, exceptional, and successful coaches who have unique backgrounds as former HR leaders. I know they'll provide insights and offer valuable perspectives on navigating the complexities of today's HR leadership. So let me introduce them. Supriti Bandari is an executive coach with over 25 years of experience, specializing in coaching C-suite executives across the globe. With her background as Vice President of HR at Wipro Limited, Supriti excels in talent management, organizational effectiveness, using a blend of data-based assessments and cognitive coaching. Makeda Brown is an executive coach with extensive experience in transformation and change management, with a history in executive leadership with HR at companies like Merck. Makeda specializes in DEI strategies and team effectiveness, aiming to accelerate talent development and enhance business outcomes. And Kimberly Suter is an executive advisor who brings more than 20 years of senior HR and consulting experience, focusing on leadership assessment, integration, and executive development. Kim has worked in senior HR leadership roles with global organizations like Merrill Lynch, Citibank, and Source HOV, helping leaders integrate and thrive in complex business environments. So welcome, everyone. And let's move to the first question. Could you share your journey from being an HR executive to becoming a coach and advisor for HR and line operating executives? What insights have you gained as an HR executive that have contributed to your success and great track record as a coach? So Supriti, let's start with you.
Great. Thank you, Bill. So, I think as an HR executive myself, there are all these different hats that one wore, right? There was HR as the strategic advisor. There was HR as the talent architect, liaison to the board, HR as the leader of the function. And then there was HR as a coach confidant. And for me, that was my favorite part of it. I loved holding the space for leaders and helping them navigate kind of the paradoxes of leadership, right? I think the toughest decisions are not right versus right or right versus wrong. Those are the easy decisions. It's the right versus right. That was a lot of fun. And I think I thought there was an opportunity to parlay some of that experience of helping leaders scale into becoming a coach. So here I am 12 years later and having a lot of fun with coaching.
Great, thanks. How about you, Makeda?
Thanks, Bill. And I would echo Supriti's point that as HR leaders, we had the opportunity to do many things. But in my journey, what I really enjoyed most is that I saw organizations through the various points of their journey, whether they were in the mode of growth, contraction, bringing organizations together, or even separating them when you think of mergers and acquisitions. But that experience helped me, one, really understand what the business drivers are, which I think is so important, right? Connecting to what our contributions do in driving impact for the business as leaders. But as well, in really shaping the people experience, there is a human side to leadership that I took away from my HR background. If anything, what I feel it really brings in terms of an insight from a coaching standpoint is that change is constant. And as leaders and individuals, we have the opportunity to not only appreciate what strengths we can bring to that change, but thinking about where we need to flex and adopt. And I think coaching really gives us the opportunity to reflect situationally what's needed and how to bring our best and bring our people to that. So those combinations, I think, really were things that I took away from my HR journey, but I also bring in the impact that I can have on leaders.
Thanks. Kim?
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate it. I loved being an HR leader. The opportunity to influence and help drive business results to me was such an incredible challenge. And exactly as my colleagues have indicated, just the opportunity to have that impact and be a part of the organization, being able to look at all of the different pieces, but also playing such a key role in it. And I think the opportunity to continue that work with Crenshaw has really been so exciting for me, because you really take that experience and you think about all of the work that I've done with senior executives internally, the opportunity to influence, provide feedback, provide all of the development in the line operating experience, and then really take that and link it to an executive's motivation. How do you influence change? How do you help them look at the levers of change and all the critical experiences? But also, more importantly, as I needed to do internally, how do you quickly build rapport and trust with individuals, especially ones that you're meeting externally for the first time, new to the organizations? That's such a critical component of what we do. And then really look at what's going to make the biggest difference for this executive within this organization. Break down the resistance to making change. All of those things were so critical to establishing internal relationships. They're even more critical in the condensed timeline that we have to do that externally. But it's all how we work effectively with executives and taking those things and transferring them. So it's really been a great journey for a number of years now.
Supriti, let me just follow up with a question, which is, do you see a difference between coaching HR leaders and coaching line executives?
Oh, that's a great question. If I look at coaching goals, I'll go to data, which is my go-to when I, arrive at an observation. If I look at the coaching goals, Bill, they are very similar. The coaching goals are still in the areas of how do I navigate complex conflict, or how do I influence better, points that Kimberly was mentioning, right? So the goals seem to be largely similar, but I think the complexity that the HR leaders face today has changed dramatically. So that's where I notice the shift, the environments, and this is probably true for business too, but HR more so, because I think the tensions they feel, employees are looking to them to be the employee champions, and the board and the CEO and the leadership team are looking to them to be the business champions. And there is some inherent polarity sometimes in this. And that's the tension I think they have to navigate.
So that really leads into the next question. And Kate, I'll start with you. But if you think about the environment we've just talked about, which is the pace of the environment, the complexity, what are some of the consistent themes and challenges you're addressing when you're advising HR leaders specifically?
I was going to say there's a couple things that jump to the top of the list. One, really shaping the talent strategy, because it's constantly evolving. Not only are we, ensuring that we have the right people at the right time for today, but with everything that's changing from a technology impact and otherwise, we know there's so much that we need to start investing in now in shaping the talent of the future. And so talent being kind of the capital T at the top of that list, that I think many HR leaders are accountable for, but also navigating as that landscape changes. Secondly, it's shaping the employee experience, right? When we think about a collection of individuals with many strengths, as HR leaders, we're always thinking about how do we make sure there are no barriers for them to bring their best to the environment day to day. The reality is motivations are changing. The expectations of what a colleague might have of an organization shifts. Being able to really look at the experience end to end and really operationalize what will effectively allow people to contribute, I think, is a second area. Lastly, I would say culture. And I know the adage is what culture eats strategy alive. The reality is also evolving the culture, right, is important. And I think as we were noting in the last point of discussion, HR needs to do that with others, right? So when we think about their ability to have a compelling message, to bring people along that change curve in support of the people, strategy, and agenda, I think that's a unique element of their role as well. So probably a lot more than you asked for there, Bill, but a few thoughts that came to mind.
Kim?
I think influence is so critical. I think it's, the opportunity, as everyone's talked about in terms of the strategy and the talent and all of those pieces. But I mean, you can be brilliant and a brilliant strategist, but if you really don't have the ability to influence, which I think is so critical to the HR role, and I think really you need to be the trusted advisor on people issues. You can't just be a voice around the table. I think it's a really important role relative to being that person that the leadership team really respects and defers to on those types of issues. So how does that HR leader really build that rapport, that trust, be able to keep confidences, because that's so critical, right? How do you deliver tough feedback in a way that doesn't damage the relationship? You can't just be the person who sits around the table, observes all of this, but isn't a part of helping to resolve it. If you're going to be one of the CEO's critical team members, but also advisors, you have to be someone who can work behind the scenes on a lot of these things that are getting in the way of this leadership team operating well together. So I think that's an important part of it. I think successfully assessing and integrating talent is such a key deliverable. So how do they help do that? It's still a little more of an art than it's going to be a science. And so how do we kind of work through those pieces? Almost all the HR executives that I speak with, this is a big piece of what they're trying to deliver. And there's still a little bit of catch up. How do you look at, accurately assessing the potential to be a leader or the potential to just continue being bench strength in the organization, looking at the growth? And I think this is really where Crenshaw excels. Both their tools and their coaches and advisors have just such great expertise in this area.
I would probably just add the idea of judgment, right? Like, how do we help HR executives sharpen their judgment? So having even a broader toolkit of whether it's through reading, whether it's through socializing ideas, whether it's by active learning of digital, like all of these things will help sharpen that judgment, I think, which, especially as they lead these multi-generational workforces where the line between what's professional and personal has become very blurry now, right? And, people want to bring their whole self to the workplace. And so then that whole thing comes with some consequences at times. So I think having sound judgment is probably a theme that I see a lot.
Great, thanks. Well, staying with that theme, a couple of months ago, I interviewed Kevin Cox, who was in the CHRO at GE, and they had just produced a paper on model of a world-class CHRO. And, we talked a little bit about how the CHRO today is to the CEO in the company what the CFO was to the CEO in the company during the financial crisis. And so their role has certainly evolved as a critical advisor to the CEO. Several CHROs have talked to us over the past couple of months about how do I have my team replicate the relationship that the CHRO, has with the CEO? How does my team replicate that relationship with the business partners? And so we talked a little bit about this in the last question, but what are some of the leadership skills that will allow HR business partners to the businesses to influence their business partner and have an impact on that performance and the overall team's performance? So, Kim?
I think this is a really critical one in terms of the cascading of this. So they need to not only have a really strong understanding of the business. I just don't think you can be an effective HR leader internally without that, without understanding what can the HR function do to help drive the success of the business goals. And so that's really hard for you to do if you really don't understand at an in-depth level what it is that the executives are trying to achieve, what's the success of their goals, how does it tie, and it's things such as weighing in with influence on those critical issues so that you again are that voice that has that respect. I think it's elevating the staffing functions so that you're not just attracting, bodies per se as just a staffing churn and volume, but it's attracting the best talent. And then how do you successfully integrate that talent? We've seen so many instances where executives, but also many layers beneath. You go through this incredibly intense process of recruiting, and then the next thing, it doesn't stick. So how do we successfully integrate that? How do we develop that talent so that we're maximizing potential? How do we basically take that to the highest level? What are the organizational plans and structures that are going to help businesses leverage that talent?
Right.
And I think you need to be intellectually agile. That's kind of a non-starter, that you need to be able to keep up with the business quickly, but also be curious and really extremely adept at building trust, as I mentioned earlier. You've got to be able to have the confidence of the management team and those relationships across the organization. I think those are key attributes that I would look at.
Thanks. Supriti?
I would add listening, especially active listening, like that whole suite of skills as coaches that we all, wonderfully get trained in, right? But to me, it's the idea of asking questions as a way of furthering the conversation, the sell versus the tell, as one of my teachers used to say. I also think it's really about listening for emotion. Like, what is the real meaning? Like, not the words. And so the minute I think we're able to triangulate all that as HR executives, we're able to see patterns that perhaps are less visible, if we don't use the skill effect.
I would agree. I think in working with CEOs, CHROs have the opportunity to understand kind of what is important, why it's important when we think about the strategy and what we're hoping for. But as well, really getting curious about what is the how. And I know that's a weird question to ask, but the how really helps the HR leader, executive to better formulate what does this mean from a people perspective. And so sometimes those questions around what are we looking to deliver, what's the metric, but the how and how we do it, what's the mindset that we need to embrace, because those are often the insights we need as HR leaders to take back to formulate the people strategy that will enable business success. So I always say, remain curious, engage with your leaders in understanding what they hope for, what they might fear, and leverage those insights to put into action in your own efforts as an HR.
Let's shift a little bit, which is, what are some of the organizational and workforce drivers behind increased demand for and the opportunity of HR leaders to have a broader business impact? So why don't we start with you, Supriti?
So look at the macro, right? And how much it has changed. I started working a little over 30 years ago, and I look at the macro now versus then. And it's just, I think, probably the most level of uncertainty that exists that perhaps, at least in my career, professionally, one has seen, right? And so from that perspective, whether it's a regulatory pressure, whether it's, if you're expanding as a global company, right, and you're sitting in one country, like what might be data privacy laws in some other country. So having sort of that understanding of that world, I think, is important, even as we design and do the more routine sort of policy work of human resources, the evil HR director work, as Gilbert famously said. And then there is, of course, the business pressures, the global, environment. There's the geopolitics. And that's kind of certainly in the last 4 years, I think, become so much more relevant. We saw it with Google, we see it with so many companies now in terms of their positions on these things. Back in the day, our personal opinions were our personal opinions, and then we came to work. And now I think that line has really got blurred.
McKenna?
Yes, I would echo the global landscape is a consideration. I also think it's a great place to learn from, right? In understanding how other markets are engaging their employees towards business success. I think keeping an eye on technology is a challenge, but also one we must be astute in, not only for how we can leverage technology to enable the employee experience, but also how is technology impacting capability, impacting the pace of change and how it supports the organization. Lastly, I would just say the opportunity to challenge the status quo when it comes to our view of what the employment contract is or what the employment environment is. I think we know we're in the midst of a time where that is being revolutionized in terms of the wants of our colleagues, the balance, as we've mentioned, in terms of both personal and professional needs all coming together. And so I would say, staying astute to what is happening and really looking for the insights that hopefully can drive the changes that are necessary to engage the organization, hopefully in a way that continues the legacy that all of us hope for in the success of our clients.
Are we seeing any trends in CHROs investing in the leadership and development of their teams? So Willem Genesee with us talks about cobbler's children syndrome, which is there's a lot of investment in terms of scaling leaders, right, and development. We see it in a lot of our engagements. Does anyone see a trend now in the CHRO investing more and more in the development of their leaders from giving them a coach and advisor?
I think it's an interesting question, Bill, because I don't think we see as much of it as we would like to, but I will tell you that my latest engagement is actually with an HR executive reporting to, the head, very specifically based on all of the core hard skills, but not as much of the influence as he needs relative to the business components and his two business heads. So I think obviously one data point doesn't mark a trend, but on the other hand, hopefully we'll start to see more of this, because I think Willem's quite right that, certainly when I was an HR leader, I invested a lot in external development. I would send people to training and, off to different programs and that type of thing. But I think we're seeing more now that an actual advisor that can work with that individual as opposed to my coaching of the person. And just what does that do and how does it benefit them?
Let's shift to culture a minute, which is how does an organization's culture influence team effectiveness? How do your engagements address culture in a way that optimizes overall effectiveness? So, Kim?
I think, one of the things we all know is how an organization's culture can obviously really hurt or help individuals and the organizations and how they're functioning and the effectiveness of that. There's so many ways that an organization, that its culture can either shut down or actually encourage great ideas, tamp down or enhance the morale, or reward or penalize a leader's growth. We've all seen so many examples of that. And it's, those subtle ripples and undercurrents that we learn as we're starting to work with executives. So I think that that's such a piece that my goal in all of the engagements is to really fully understand how the culture is impacting the individual and how it may be hurting their growth, and what it is that we can really look at in terms of the things that they can change and how I can help them influence those things. But also, how do I help them successfully navigate the things that they can't change or influence, right? Some of these cultures are embedded and it's going to take time and energy, especially at the senior executive level. So there are some things that people have to learn how to navigate. How do they show up in those situations in a way that isn't so energy intensive in terms of draining, but also difficult for them in terms of how they're perceived?
Makeda, same question about culture.
Yeah, I would say, again, I appreciate this question because I think we are all very much focused on getting the what done of our organizational efforts, but the culture really emphasizes the how, and we need to understand what that is. I love what Kim mentioned. Sometimes in helping individuals through their efforts as leader, we need to actually understand what are the truths of this culture. Is it a collaborative culture? Is it a more of a hierarchical culture? What are the things in your own leadership style that resonate with that? And where might you need to flex? And again, in the spirit of HR leaders kind of being so accountable for the influencing in their role, it's so important that that understanding of culture is present in how they show up, but also in influencing or creating and shaping what that looks like in the future. So I'm glad that the culture is a focus, but I think if anything, I would say more time can be dedicated to that in terms of how we're influencing that as leaders, but of course, HR playing a significant role.
And Makeda, have you seen an increase in the awareness of how important and critical culture is to overall business performance?
I would say yes. And I had mentioned in our discussion earlier, just in looking at where organizations are in their journey, being able to, I would say the cost has been when we haven't looked at culture, sometimes we don't get to the business success we're looking for. So thinking of two companies coming together in a merger, we're rushing and getting everything ready for day one and announcing, and suddenly we stop, not realizing that these two organizations have operated differently. Culture really says we need to reestablish what are those common ways of working, right? So that we can continue to engage in what the success of the business is. And it's that piece, it's the intangible sometimes that we can't find it in a dashboard. We don't always have ways that we can see it, but it is so important as HR colleagues that we give voice to that and making sure there's an intention around what is the culture that we want versus it being assumed it'll just happen.
Thanks. Supriti?
So one of the themes that I've observed in the last few years, especially during COVID, was this shift to team coaching. Before that, a lot of our work was one-on-one, we went in person, all of that, right? And the fact that globally it sort of reset that button on we are all virtual now. And I think a lot of L&D professionals then kind of obviously immediately shifted to what tools we have and so on. But to me, that shift to team coaching has become much more visible now. And I link it to the idea of culture, because as coaches, what coaches do during the assessment process of the teams is one of the things that get unpacked through our Crenshaw toolkit is the values, right? What is it that you care about? What are some beliefs you hold? What are some values you hold? And therefore, what kind of behaviors is that leading to? And that forms part of the culture. And sometimes we can have competing values. I can value achievement and I can value helping others. And at times you have to choose. And so I think the team conversations, the team coaching work is very, very powerful in uncovering some of that and uncovering people's own biases around their values, I think.
And so you've seen an increase in engagements for team effectiveness or optimization. And how do you play culture into it, like in the engagement itself?
The discovery process is helpful, right? As part of the discovery process that we do as assessors, the one-on-one interviews to understand, right, how are decisions made? And there's the formal org structure, and then there's kind of the people who are really in the know, right? So I think that really uncovers a lot of these sort of micro behaviors of culture, the nuances.
Right.
And then I think it's easier to bring that in. I mean, we did a workshop for a client of ours where the discovery was very helpful in understanding, how not just the leader, but how the colleagues were playing with each other.
Right.
And, then you just put it out there, like, here's the data. There's no judgment, This is what we are observing.
Yeah.
And people respond to that.
And so how do you create that safe environment to have that kind of discussion?
I think you have to contract with the executive clearly, right? And to be honest, this doesn't always work because if that trust, that psychological safety with the CEO is not there, then I think people do hold back because they do worry that, this could be career ending, right? Me speaking up to you one-on-one is one thing, but me speaking in front of this executive team is career ending. So I'm not trying to minimize that. But I do think there's a lot of prep work that goes up to that sort of team coaching event to prepare the ground.
So Kim, for a second, talk to me about psychological safety, which is Supriti just mentioned.
Yeah, no, I think it's such a critical piece, right? The coaching environment, and I mentioned this earlier in terms of the rapport and the trust that you have to build. And so I think this is a really key piece that the executive that you're working with, whether it's a team assignment or whether it's individual executives, has to feel that what they're sharing and the work that they are talking about, because sometimes there's going to be challenges within the organization that they need to talk freely about, and that is something that is going to be an environment that you can hold and respect, but that you also have a responsibility to the executive sponsor team to help them better understand how their goals are being met in terms of why they wanted this individual or this team to work with a coach in the first place. So I think it's understanding how you can help those individuals, but also hold that dear in terms of individual confidences that aren't shared, and then work with the sponsor team in a way that you're looking at the patterns and the trends and things. I also really, really encourage the execs that I work with, and I would with teams as well, to share their assessment results or even a summary of those assessment results with their boss. I think it's really important. If you're working with me, the individual that you're working most closely with every day is most likely going to be the team or the individual individual that you report to in terms of seeing those behaviors. And then I also encourage them to share the 360 summary, because I put a lot of action plans in the 360. So even if you don't want to get into all the particulars of it, because I'm going to share patterns and themes of it as I tell them, share that. Ask your team, ask your peers, and ask your boss to help you monitor some of these things so that you're showing up a little bit vulnerable, but you're asking for help in a way that is encouraging other people to be aware they're already involved in your 360. You've asked for their help in that way. So how do you then move into something that feels safe for you, but also pushes your vulnerability just a little bit so that your risk isn't closed like this?
Makeda, you recently was involved in a cohort program, and I'm just curious how possibly some of those discussions and trust came up in the cohort sessions that you were involved in.
Absolutely. So I'll speak to how trust came up, I think, from two lenses. Having a cohort of leaders together on a learning or development journey, it gives them the space in just the spirit of learning together to know they're not alone in the things that they're facing as leaders. And it was really revealing in that cohort, regardless of what function or department they were in with this particular client, that they had a kind of a shared desire to continue to grow and improve, but also in some cases dealing with similar challenges. I feel in this example, as Kim has mentioned, having the cohort have an opportunity to share out their observations with a coach as a facilitator to their senior leaders really helped for more open dialogue, an opportunity to better appreciate the perspectives and the challenges and the whys in ways where they could come together and define steps that they can take to continue to be successful in the organization as leaders. And so it was a great opportunity, even just things like definition. What does it mean to have executive presence in this organization? How does that show up in the impact that we might have with our customers? It allowed a very rich discussion because we had that opportunity to create an environment of sharing, which garnished a lot of trust for everyone.
Supriti, has executive presence come up recently in any of your engagements?
All the time, Bill.
All the time.
And, I think it's also because it's such an omnibus term, right? I think, to Makeda's point, different people actually mean different things. And to me, it's unpacking that nuance of what is it that you mean by executive presence? What would you like to see happen? I realize a part of it is this whole sartorial, how do you look? And, that part, are you put together? But that's just such a small part of it, right? So much more of it is kind of the poise, the gravitas, the decisiveness, the courage under fire, all of these themes. But unpacking that is, I think, very interesting.
Well, that's a really good distinction, because I actually like the term executive impact versus presence, because there's a connotation or an interpretation of presence, right? And what that means. And I think we're all talking about the impact someone can have, right? Communication, gravitas, all of those things, really critical.
Well, and I think too, Bill, just to add to Supriti's point, I think, that's such an important distinction to make in terms of that, little label that we get on the present side. But so much of our job is equipping executives to have some of those difficult conversations that allow them to build trust, credibility, respect, etc. People shy away from a lot of those difficult conversations. And a lot of times what I think is important for us to do to unpack, what is that risk aversion? And is it really just something that you brought here, or has the environment exacerbated it? But all of these people who are reluctant to have direct and open and honest conversations, it really detracts from their presence. It detracts from their ability to be a senior leader, and especially followership, right? People admire individuals who can have those tough conversations in a way that they won't damage relationships, that they can continue to grow.
Tell me about how you individually have evolved as a coach over the years. What experiences shape your coaching approach and evolution? So, Makeda?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I really embrace as a coach that I think was always there in the past, even in my HR roles, but I am able to dedicate more time to it today, is the opportunity to set people up for success. I think any one of us, if we are in this arena as it relates to people and helping them do their best, we need to be thoughtful around what are we providing them to set them up for success. Now, coaching, I think, is a excellent way to do that. My wish would be people would receive coaching much earlier in their career journey and not later or reserved to certain levels within an organization. But at all those pivot points, right? I'm going in from an individual contributor to a manager of managers. My scope is increasing to global. These are points of change where we do need to allow people a safe space to think about the mindset they're bringing to the role. Is it serving them or might it cost them if they're not aware? As well, an opportunity to kind of check in on behaviors. Are the behaviors that you are tapping into matching the situational elements that you are facing? And so if anything, I think I would encourage anyone, and I think most importantly, our HR leaders, you are the steward of that, right? Of the people space. How do you continue to reflect on what is needed to set people up for success in your organization?
Right. Supriti?
So I love this question. This was one of my favorite questions here. We're talking about how did you evolve as a coach and an advisor, right? And so for me, firstly, it took me back and I was like, I want to cut refund checks to some of my early clients because I do think I've evolved a lot. There are, of course, all the coaching skills. With practice, we all get better. But I think the one area which has been a fundamental shift for me is sort of this idea of how do we move to become more direct. I do think I've become very direct as a coach now. And that's not my natural wiring. And it took a lot of work. And I still remember that instance where that shift took place. Those are the days when we still had in-person coaching sessions. So I finished the coaching session, but I was very direct because I wanted to let my client know that, here's what I'm hearing and so on. And the entire journey back, it was a 1-hour drive back on 287 here in New Jersey. I kept thinking about, oh my God, I've hurt this person and, I have destroyed our relationship and all of that. This was my narrative. And I come home and I'm tempted to immediately sort of get into healer mode and send a note and saying, sorry, but was it too much? And I hold my emotion. And then a couple of days later, this person writes back to me and he says, that was the best session. And that was when I realized that sometimes, our own belief systems around harmony and around what direct even looks like culturally, at least for me with my own sort of journey of life, sometimes that's a bit distorted, right? And so that kind of helped me and gave me the confidence to move down the path of direct. I think our clients need us to be cheerleaders at times, but there are enough times where, it's also about holding a mirror to them. So.
Yeah, thanks for that. Kim?
I had to laugh because, of course, direct is something that I do fairly well from that perspective. But one of the things that I had to really balance out is internally, you know the landscape, the players, when you can be direct, you've got relationships that are key and you know how to balance and you're reasonably good at reading the room and the EQ and all of the pieces of it. But externally, it's really been looking at, how do I balance the direct with also understanding the environment that the executive is working in, so that there's absolutely no sense holding someone's feet to the fire if in fact the environment of the organization is prohibiting them from being able to execute in that environment. So it's really been a learning experience for me, how important that executive sponsor team, either the HR leader and the boss, or in many instances, I've got people with 2 or 3 individual execs that they report to. And so how do I really lean into those relationships, learn a lot more about the situational piece that the executive is working in? What are some of the pieces that are sometimes getting in the way that are difficult so I can balance those things out? But then also use those executive relationships as a point of leverage, helping them better understand. So it isn't just what they're seeing from the executive's growth journey, progress, etc., but that I can also talk to them about some of those challenges with the executive's permission, that we've got something that is a little bit of an influence point for me in terms of educating them a little bit. They may not be seeing this, but here's what we're hearing through the 360s that's actually a little bit of a disconnect in terms of more positive than you may have thought at the beginning of the assignment. So how do I use those relationships to better help not only the executive I'm working with, but their journey kind of through the organization.
So would you say, Kim, that the evolution, and I'll ask all of you to close, the evolution that maybe you've had is today, not just the environment, but where you come as a coach, is that you want to see yourself as a key trusted advisor to the executive that you're working with, which I'd say maybe is a slight difference or evolution of just being a coach.
No, I totally agree with that. And I'm sure that Supriti and Makeda would agree with me that, we put a lot of our time, energy, focus, but also our personal commitment into the success for the individual. So what are the goals up front? What are the, aspirations of the individual as well as the organization? And then really work so hard to make sure that you can influence that, right? Nobody wants at the end of a 6 or 12 months to be like, wow, we haven't really moved the needle more than this tiny little bit. You want to see some really significant change in behavior. And so what are the influence points with that? The trust, the rapport, but also the motivation. There are individuals that really don't see it at the beginning, that really are not particularly. I think a lot of people engage really openly, but there are some that I think we've all had that the organizations have brought them to the assignment by dragging them a little bit. And they've agreed, but it's really more of a political agree than I see the issue. And my job is to pretty quickly help them understand this is an investment that the company is making in them and what an incredible benefit that is that so many people don't get, and don't waste it. So how do I find the hook that is going to be motivating for that individual to influence? Because as I always say to them, this is hard work. Like if it wasn't, wouldn't really be effective. So this is going to be work. But my job as an advisor is to help you find an easier way to do this. How do I find more, arrows in the quiver per se, to give you the tools that are going to help you navigate some of these things that you find challenging now, that take your energy in a negative direction as opposed to a positive.
Makeda, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think from the standpoint of being an effective coach with anyone, my desire is to really partner with you towards those factors of success, right? So it's important that we understand upfront what does success look like, and we're walking together in terms of what are the ways in which we're going to bridge to that. One of the things that I often say, we can measure that success, which again, I know sometimes that might not be intuitive from a coaching standpoint, but being able to note both tangibly and intangibly the value that you are desiring is important. So I hope at the end of any coaching engagement that the leaders I get the opportunity to work with, that they actually can see progress, right? And those things that are tangible. But I would say the magic is in the intangible. You're more confident. You're viewing situations not as challenges, but as opportunities. And you're excited, if anything, to pour into others in the same way that you took the time to pour into yourself through your organization's investment.
I don't even see them as two different things, the coach and the advisor. I mean, I almost see it as this intermolecular space. And I see them as different hats, maybe, right? That there are times you wear the advisor hat. And, there's only so much we get with the Socratic sparring, asking questions again and again, and especially when you're working with leaders who perhaps don't have that skill or the perspective, right? And so, in moments like that, you have to put on your advisor hat and you have to introduce them to the additional tools that they could consider for their toolkit, right? And then there are times you just have to hold the space where that advisory business is not going to work because they're just not ready for that conversation. So,
okay, well, this has been terrific. And first of all, not just thanks for the time, but all the great work you do with us on a day-to-day basis and the executives that you're working with. So, thanks.